I'm honored to be here and to have Marian in the first row. And for a moment of panic of speaking to scholars of Łódź history, and in my many interests, Łódź is not top 10 list. I have 2 sets of glasses, so I clearly qualify as keynote speaker material. I'm still learning to appreciate this blessing of aging. So I want to start, and in a way, this fantastic panel that we've just heard is already engaging with what I was hoping to do here, which is to think together about the field of urban Jewish history with urban Eastern European Jewish history, with Łódź somewhere in the center. But I want to start with, and the legacy of the writing that we all are writing with. So I want to start with a little bit of an overview to say that historians of urban Jewish experience use the term Jewish metropolis very sparingly, and I'm not into numbers, but I counted in a fantastic late David Beale's Cultures of the Jews, a New History, that the term metropolis is somewhere around 14 times, and urban and cities and Jews in urban context, endless number of times as a crucial term, both across chronological and geographic span. For the modern period, they focus on rapid social, economic, and political changes in the second half of the 19th century and the impact of industrialization and urbanization on new models of communal life, Jewish culture, religious expression, and more. And again, we already got a taste of it. In recent years, scholars have applied it to new and fast-growing Jewish centers, Berlin, New York, Toronto, and Tel Aviv, among others, underscoring the global nature of the phenomenon. When applied to Eastern Europe, the term has been used for Warsaw, which François Guénet argues was the first European Jewish metropolis. Indeed, one of the most comprehensive and recent volumes devoted to its Jews is aptly, and François already mentioned it, titled Warsaw, the Jewish Metropolis, co-edited by François Guénet and Glenn Diner. In this volume, Guénet examines the rise of the Jewish metropolis, while David Engel raises questions about its end by looking at the attempts to rebuild Jewish communal life after the war. In his Kiev, a Jewish metropolis, Natan Meir describes the city as, quote, something of a tabula rasa on which its new Jewish residents could inscribe their vision of corporate Jewish existence. And he goes on to show many different experimentations of Jewish communal life. But for other scholars of East European Jewish history, metropolitan nature of their geographic context is even self-evident. So, for example, Elisa Ben-Porad has applied the term to Soviet Minsk without explaining why this is a metropolitan context, and Michael Beiser did it for Leningrad. In the case of Łódź, which brings us to this fascinating conference, it's Filip Friedman's work that offers us insight into his perspective on writing of urban Jewish history in general and the history of Łódź in particular. It serves for me as an example of scholarship that simultaneously sought to inscribe Łódź into several historiographies and address several audiences. As a scholar of social and economic history, Friedman, a Galician-born and Vienna-trained historian, also very much into numbers, published pioneering studies in Polish, Yiddish, German, about its economic development and transformation into the center of textile industry, about the rise and fall of its markets, and the ways in which national and imperial politics shaped the lives of inhabitants of Łódź. But Friedman was primarily a historian of Jews, motivated by his interest in the emergence of Jewish population and its institutions, Jewish-Christian relations, and continued Jewish struggle for equal rights. He sort of shifted that interest from writing about Galicia into writing about Łódź. As such, he played an important role as a minority historian, arguing with historical documents against vilification of Jews. Last but not least, he sought his role as a public intellectual. He was involved in efforts to bring the knowledge of history to Łódź Jews and to the inhabitants, rendering the history of Łódź understandable and relevant, especially in the immediate local context. Today, I want to revisit his work as a starting point for a conversation about the field of East European Jewish urban history. He was largely responsible for creating a discussion about Łódź, scholarly, academic, historical discussion about Łódź with Jews as its main protagonists. I argue that his relevance relied on 4 tropes. One, showing ancient roots of the community, obviously not ancient per se, but roots that were ancient in relation to the beginning of Łódź as a modern industrial center. 2, by stressing an ongoing heroic struggle for Jewish rights. 3, by engaging in a discourse of Jewish contribution, which tied the Jews to the city and its achievements. And 4, last but not least, his social economic lens that allowed to put the focus on both traditional Jewish institutions and elites and the lay members of the community, writing sort of egalitarian and history and bringing from the margins the poor and even at times women. So let me first talk about inscribing the rise of the Jewish community into the industrial history of Łódź. In becoming a historian of Jews in Łódź, Friedman relied on models of writing urban history, paying close attention to the arrival of the new inhabitants, first manufacturing initiatives, changing profile of the production and commerce, and the official policies of the authorities planning this industrial center, as Francois reminded us in the last discussion. He integrated the history of the Jews with the history of industrial rise of the city. And thus, in the study on the beginnings of industry in Łódź, in the early 1820s, Jews are mentioned when the author discussed the influx of merchants at the turn of the 18th century and the slow rise in the number of Jews as inhabitants on the eve of industrialization. He then brings examples of Jewish merchants involved in trading in wool and cloth in the first decades of the 19th century, and Jewish merchants of cotton products, as well as first requests of Jewish merchants to set up storage of yarn and then other enterprises. But he does not write with this Jewish lens as a main one. When Friedman began his project, which was likely a result of his move to Łódź with its institutions and its archives, he worked as a teacher, so it was convenient to run to the archives after he taught his classes, the same way that Emanuel Ringelblum continued to be an active historian in Warsaw. Writing history of the Jewish community in Łódź presented its Jewish chroniclers with several challenges. They could not simply rely on readily available Jewish models. In the introduction to a 1938 monograph of the Old Jewish Cemetery in Łódź, Pinkus Nadel, a secretary of the Jewish community of Łódź, described doubts about whether the city even deserved to be historicized. And I quote, "The thought of publishing a monograph about the Jewish cemetery that has been closed for 40 years now initially has not found support. Antiquity and value of cultural artifacts and art objects are so subjective that this is very difficult to find for them a uniform measure. Therefore, it should not be surprising that for some, the age of the Łódź cemetery arose serious concerns. Consideration was given not only to this detail, but also to whether the Old Jewish Cemetery deserves memorialization, uwiecznienie in Polish. Indeed, the beginning of Jewish collective life in our town cannot take pride in famous personalities or great history. Jewish Łódź is neither the ancient mines or Worms, or Kraków covered in patina, or Prague surrounded by legends, or Lublin overgrown with moss. Over a century of existence is a bit too short for the history of culture." I think we disagree. In the pageant of Jewish ghettos, and he means here Jewish towns, not Nazi ghettos, it is simply a baby. Moreover, in our case, it is a parvenu city. This historical past can be covered in just one jump. Without saying so explicitly, Nadel alluded here to an earlier and still practiced Jewish tradition of writing communal history through the lens of a designation as Ir Va'em B'Israel, city and mother in Israel, a term that was based on a quote from the second book of Samuel, chapter 20, verse 19. It was not only a Jewish center in this context. Rather, it stressed the role of a center of rabbinic scholarship and underscored the status as a Jewish self-haven. It was used for such populous Ashkenazic communities as Prague, Kraków, and Frankfurt, but also Salonika and Fez, at least since the early 16th century in printed Hebrew books. It was used, for example, by Reb Shmuel Feivish, son of Rabbi Natan Feitel, in 1658 in his description of the Chmielnicki massacres, multiple times where he says, this community, Irva and Israel was destroyed, this community was destroyed. In this way, it was also applied to Kraków by Matityahu Zuntz in his 1874 Ir HaTzedek, Toldot Rabbanei Kraków, about Kraków and about its rabbinic elite. The term did not fit Łódź and its early history, and Friedman's work underscored that difference when writing about a young and dynamic community, a destination for Jewish migrants, a place of economic and communal experimentation, especially during the period between the middle and late 19th century. Well, and Francois showed us beyond. He delved into broad demographic processes that shaped the community and its size because, as Robert Shapiro notes, it grew from a hamlet of 767 people, including 259 Jews in 1820, to a city of 670,000 with a Jewish community of more than 230,000, to a city, the second largest in Poland. Friedman examined the ways more traditional communal structures, such as the Hevra Kadisha, the Holy Society, which in Łódź was more, as he puts it, aristocratic and far more inclusive than it would be assumed, existed side by side with new setups and striking changes in the institutional fabric of the community. During this period, demographic, political, and cultural changes heralded the emergence of the Jewish metropolis, not the first. Importantly, Friedman was particularly interested in what he called zróżniczkowanie, or the diversification among Jews settling and living in Łódź in the 19th century and beyond, class differences and internal communal tensions they produced. While not harbingers of modernity, credited with the transformation of the small town into an industrial center, Jews, in Friedman's writings played a significant role in that qualitative shift from earlier forms of production to larger factories. Friedman sought to analyze it and offered its own periodization with the first stage of changes in which Jews played a significant role, ending in 1864. It is when Jews, I quote, participate in a textile production in three forms: as organizers of cottage industry, in which labor force worked at home with their own equipment, having received the raw material with the order; as weavers and handicraftsmen, and as industrialists who owned increasingly large industrial plants. Repeatedly applying the apologetic lens of Jewish contribution, Friedman argues, for example, that Jewish merchants, with their particular mindset and particular skills, it goes back to our, again, discussion last session, played such an out of their numerical presence role in developing cottage industry and then in cloth industry in the last decades of 18th century and then 19th century, as they provided raw material and sold ready products in Łódź and beyond, expanding the sales. Here, Friedman responded to the charges of exploitative nature of the system blamed on Jews in particular, which he stresses in several publications was neither intended or invented or practiced exclusively by Jews. And if practiced by Jews, not only vis-a-vis Christians. Friedman brings examples of enterprises that helped the weavers at time of acute crisis, such as the initiative of Lazer Berger, who in the late 1820s employed a large number of weavers of cotton in production in cottage industry, and was even accepted into the Łódź Weavers' Assembly, Łódzkie Zgromadzenie Tkackie. During the crisis of 1844-1845, again, in the midst of depression, unemployment, lack of capital, and poverty among weavers, which eventually led to increase in cottage industry, as many Jewish merchants became manufacturers with factories. This ended up being a positive development, he argues, for those weavers. Jews sold this production to Jewish merchants arriving in Łódź and helped to further develop the production. Similarly, receipts were used not just in textile industry, but also between dyers and merchants. Friedman noted, I quote, "There is no doubt that the cottage industry spared many weavers from abject poverty and unemployment, and did so in a way that was more effective than municipal enterprises organized during the same period at great cost. On the other hand, it enforced maximum efficiency of labor, but also low remuneration and led to ruthless exploitation." So exploitation existed, but it had a positive effect as well, and there was nothing uniquely Jewish about it. Arguing that the development was dictated by economic necessity, Friedman rejected the charge of Jews being involved in smuggling goods or extraordinary callousness in treating the weavers and the dyers. He went as far as to suggest that, again, I quote, "Thanks to the cottage industry, a great number of craftsmen," this is already for the second half of 19th century, managed to keep their workshops and their independence despite growing competition with great industry, which had the advantage of modern purposeful organization of technical means and great capital. The cottage industry system gave masses of artisans a surrogate of this organization and sui generis capitalist form of home production, end of quote. Friedman also underscored Jews were to be found at the bottom of the system, as well as Jewish weavers emerged in Łódź who participated in cottage industry along with their Christian counterparts, and that their relations with the Jewish buyers were just as tense. And he cites examples of violence and abuse, Jews on Jews, class-related violence and abuse. Here too, he insisted that the Jewish artisans involved in cottage industry, or at least some of them, lived miserable lives, right? So Jews were not only involved in making fortunes or making the lives of the working class difficult. Here, I wonder if this was important. How was this important for his potential readers, struggling Jewish working class in Łódź during the Great Depression years when much of Friedman's work was published, or for his non-Jewish Polish readers in Łódź? Moreover, Christian and Jews came up with new forms of economic interactions. So there is this experimentation that is specifically tied to Jewish identity and, in fact, religious identity and interaction with Christians. And he cites one example of purchases or sales to Jewish entrepreneurs that were done at night after Shabbat to avoid condemnation in the darkness, to avoid condemnation by non-Jewish public opinion. Friedman ties together Jewish participation in the early stages of the economic transformation of Łódź and shows Jewish contribution in various forms. For Friedman, the Jewish struggle to enter the profession of weaver is another example of changes to the economic structure of the Jewish masses in Poland. Both in terms of Jewish economic initiatives in organizing production and in labor, he underscores difficulties Jews had to overcome receiving licenses and work. And here he goes back and forth, especially in his more popular versions of his writing, showing how much current relations continue the pattern. Indeed, increasing numbers of Jews worked at home because, he says, they were employed by, they were not employed by new factories the same way their Christian counterparts were. In opposing the entrance of Jews to the profession, Christian weavers accused them of smuggling cheap yarn, while they themselves used it as well. And again, Friedman goes out of his way to counter the accusations that he finds in the sources, kind of collective accusations against Jews. Even as the guild system was losing influence, he says, Jews struggle entering various new professions in Łódź. To become professional weavers, they had to prove sufficient practice, but German ones were not teaching Jews willingly. Thus, Jewish candidates who at times had to falsify their applications or buy them, and then this collectively harmed the reputation of the Jews, but Friedman shows that they really had no other way to do so. In the second part of the century, they experienced prejudice where large factories opened and Jews were blocked from employment there, and were continued instead to work at home or in small handicraft workshops. A pattern, he says, continues into the Second Polish Republic, and he brings examples of specific kinds of handicraft workshop that still are primarily Jewish and abound in Łódź. Friedman makes sure to show Jewish society as far from uniform in its attitudes. He examines, for example, the social and economic profile of the Jewish community with a particular attention to the working class, the majority of whom were poor or middle-class elements. Not all difficulties of the Jewish masses are blamed on prejudice and Christians fearing competition. That difficulty was also linked to attitudes in a Jewish community which perceived initially weaving as a sinful profession, and according to folklore, the first one to learn it from a German master was one named Natalia Aleksiun, a convert who was put under herem by the community for doing so, by the community elders, which is actually something I maybe come back at the end, the way that Friedman, for all his focus on numbers and statistics, repeatedly goes back and forth to oral tradition, witnesses are saying, and he is very ambivalent about it, but still it's something that maybe surprisingly for a historian of his style is very present in his writing. This tradition, he writes, worthless for us, the oral tradition, the folklore, as far as the facts are concerned, is valuable as far as expressing contemporary moods and aversion and superstition of the Jewish society against textile production with religious bent, and without a doubt became a serious obstacle in spreading the profession among Orthodox masses. Again, fascinating how this is on the one hand adding nothing to the facts, on the other hand shows us the moods, which is a fact as well. But too many young people, he says, were seeking to enter the profession for the opposition to be active. So in a way, there is a gradual breakthrough of the new kind of working class in Łódź, both against Christian and internal Jewish opposition. He seems particularly eager to explore the lives of Jewish pioneers who were first to enter and support themselves in the textile industry and receive required permissions, and he, in multiple editions of his work, gives us their names and tries to reconstruct their lives, including their immigration into the city, showing the pattern of arrivals of mostly merchants from outside who become important members of the industrial class and the Jewish community. Their biographies allowed him to explore further the transition from commerce to organizing weaving mills, but also their involvement in Jewish and general charity institutions. Again, something that we heard even though on the dark side from Francois, people who show up in Jewish organizations, in general organizations, and are important industrialists. And he takes great interest in describing the Jewish owners of the first large factories and enterprises. But these are not, as I said, these are not the characters of the story that replace, say, rabbis. He kind of balances this working class history with history of the great men, and these are all men. Friedman tries to establish who worked for early Jewish weaving mills owners and concludes that they must have employed Christian workers alongside Jewish ones. And he raises the question of really what this meant, that Christians and Jews live together. I think many of the questions we consider now very new about shared spaces, even if he doesn't quite use that terminology, are ingrained in that analysis. But on many of the questions, he comes back saying, well, we don't have sources. We don't have sources on this. Throughout his work, he refers to oral history and communal memory, but more as an interesting curiosity than a source. For example, he repeats the oral tradition about Abram Mojżesz Prusak, that he supposedly employed only Jews in his establishment, but Friedman cannot confirm it from other sources, so he kind of moves on and doesn't engage with imagining what this might have meant to have these supposedly this entirely Jewish enterprise. All in all, Friedman seeks to offer a critical rendition of an egalitarian social history of the emerging Jewish metropolis. It included not only his analysis of employment patterns, but also hopes among the poorest Jews from small towns arriving in Łódź or sending their sons there to learn trade. He also noted employment patterns of Jewish women, very little because he can't find sources, but he does mention it in the textile cottage industry, concluded that, for example, when families work together, women would be assigned lighter work. Jews became dominant workforce, he says, in some side branches of the industry, such as ribbon production and use of cotton scraps. And again, he jumps to say, well, when you look at the pattern today, this is how you understand the contemporary situation. It has those strong roots in the past. I also propose that in his work, implicitly, he asks about Jewish and mixed spaces in Łódź. As I mentioned earlier, he raised the possibility that Jews owned weaving mills and could turn them into Jewish spaces, but with no sufficient information to go deeper. To understand better the scholarly context in which Friedman published his research, let me just briefly refer to one review of his big monograph Dzieje Żydów w Łodzi od początków osadnictwa do roku 1863, The History of Jews in Łódź from the beginning of the settlement until 1863. And the review was published in prestigious Roczniki Dziejów Społecznych i Gospodarczych in 1936. So it was written by a Polish historian and archivist, Jan Wawrężak, who specialized in social and economic history, who expressed suspicion about alleged Jewish persecution and suffering in the more recent past. In his review, Wawrężak confirmed that the Jews played an important role in the economy of Łódź and praised Friedman for his skills in using rich archival material, which resulted in, I quote, an extensive work on the history of Jews in Łódź, filling in a gap in bibliography on this subject. Wawrężak anticipated a second, more thorough volume, which indeed would be wonderful. However, Wawrężak noted that Friedman undermined the serious result of his work by tendentious treatment of almost all more serious issues, instead of realizing that the accusations of the townspeople against Jewish tailors were just, argued Wawrężak. Friedman exaggerated anti-Jewish laws and policies and exaggerated Jewish contribution as well. It seems that Jews who followed the rules and the country's laws did not perceive limitations on settling in Łódź and were not condemned to martyrdom, in which the author, Friedman, dooms them in the years before 1862, writes Wawrężak. Wawrężak concluded his review by suggesting that Friedman's view of Jewish suffering, exaggerating view of Jewish suffering, was out of proportion. And I quote, having confirmed the constant influx of the Jews to Łódź and the rising standard of living of the Jewish population, what was the nature of this martyrdom that Jews of Łódź patiently endured for such a long time, evidently exaggerated by the author, he writes sarcastically. Now let me switch for a moment to Unsere Kinder, Our Children, 1946 semi-documentary, Yiddish semi-documentary filmed, a film directed by Nathan Gross and Saul Goskind that opens with a matinee performance attended by a group of child survivors from the Jewish orphanage in Helenuvek. If you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube with translations. It focused on the children, among them future historian Szymon Redlich, and their response to the performance of Shimon Jigan and Israel Schumacher, a beloved Yiddish comic duo. But I would like to turn for a moment to the general audience of Polish Jews in attendance, some of them likely from Łódź, who had already who had returned and who had likely been schooled in Jewish history before the Holocaust and now watched an artistic rendition of the most recent events of the Holocaust. And in the PowerPoint that I did not send in time, you would see now a still of that audience. Why the Jewish history of Łódź mattered to Polish Jews before the Holocaust, and how the Jewish urban history of Eastern Europe continues to offer a crucial lens for Jewish urban studies and Jewish history more broadly. The relationship between Jewish and non-Jewish spaces in an urban context emerges as a useful platform, an arena in which areas and approaches concerning different historical periods and geographic locations can be discussed. It is the city, metropolis, the urban context that provides both inspiration and information for such an enterprise. And so I see Friedman again here as someone who was involved in the teaching of Jewish history of Łódź and history of Łódź to these people in the audience. In December 1929, Friedman, as a teacher at the prestigious Polish Hebrew Gymnasium of the Association of Jewish Middle Schools, Towarzystwo Żydowskich Szkół Średnich for Boys, very expensive school, for boys in Łódź, organized a study group for his students. They were to investigate the past as part of their after-school activities program with student presentations, discussions, and excursions. While urban history was not their only focus, they paid particular attention to the history of the city and its surroundings. Local urban history was deemed to be important for the young generation of Polish Jews. Here, a Jewish historian and his students encountered the city they lived in through the lens of its past. So Friedman not only does it with his students, but he also takes writing, public writing, popular writing of Jewish and general history of Łódź as very important as a public intellectual. Let me come back for a moment to the secretary of the Jewish community in Łódź, Pinkus Nadel, who states in that introduction to the book on the Old Jewish Cemetery that the history of Jewish Łódź was not only short, but also witnesses to the history were still alive and could tell the story themselves. But contemporary history, so he kind of does this rhetorical twist, we don't really need historian. But then he comes back to say historians, history does not need to result from searching in dusty archives. I disagree. It can be reconstructed in real time based on the testimony of life itself. Whatever it means, I think he probably does mean testimonies of witnesses as well. In 1933, several Łódź journals advertised the publication of the third volume of Rocznik Łódzki. One of them, Głos Poranny, noted that Dr. Filip Friedman thoroughly presents in it the beginnings of the Jewish industry, of the Łódź industry between the years 1823, 1830. Now, I don't know how many people reading Głos Poranny run to the next place where they can buy Rocznik Łódzki and read the article. But it means that the article and the yearly publication was indeed meant, at least in theory, not only for academics, but also for more general interested audience. And the same article was advertised by Łódzki Głos Obywatelski and some others, but we read them. Literature about the history of our town is still rather poor. Therefore, every piece of research in this field ought to be welcomed by Jewish society, right? This inclusive society of inhabitants. Our magistrate has done a lot in this field by making available to scholars a well-arranged archive of old documents and systematically publishing the yearly scholarly journal. Friedman certainly agreed with taking this role on a public forum, with being a public intellectual beyond academic ivory tower, and participated in it in multiple ways. In 1932, for example, he published a historical essay on the origins of Łódź, its name and its coat of arms. I was actually surprised that he would be spending time on such a banal topic. And he jokingly referred to Łódź as our chimney city, Kominogród, a term that I was told was popularized by Julian Tuwim, and described the relationship between scholars and the broader audience, inhabitants of Łódź, so not just Jews. The historian's role is from time to time to inform the broader public in general terms about the results of the most recent historical research into our city's past, skipping the burden of evidence material meant only for experts. A little bit of a sense of superiority there, but nevertheless, mission he's willing to take on. In one essay, he took on explaining the origins of Łódź, speaking to the general audience of Łódź inhabitants puzzled by its many mysteries. Friedman explained, our forefathers, nasi ojcowie, so, Poles, Jews, they all had those forefathers that were interested in the past, wanting to understand the name Łódź, created a romantic hypothesis according to which Łódź owes her name to a legendary boat on which some foreigners arrived with vast treasures from faraway unknown places in the distant past. Supporters of this romantic position embellished their beautiful myth in various colorful details. But the times of romantic suppositions are gone, and the darkness of the fairy tale past must give place to the bright light of science. He is a graduate of Vienna University, after all. In a series of popular articles published in Łódzki Głos Obywatelski, he then goes on to explain spatial development of industrial Łódź, again for general public, mentioning Jews but not making them as his main focus. Jewish institutions and organizations supported historical scholarship and offered historians a stage, venue, as in the case of public lectures. So Friedman, for example, lectured in March 1931 at the Łódź branch of WIZO, Women's International Zionist Organization, on the topic z przeszłości Żydów w Łodzi, about the history of Jews in Łódź. He also presented similar work at the meetings of the Łódź chapter of Bnei Brit. Another form was community-sponsored publications, such as Friedman's contribution to the monograph on the Old Jewish Cemetery. In the introduction, Leib Mintzberg, an industrialist, head of the Jewish Kehila, Polish parliamentary deputy, and a leader of Agudat Israel, declared that this monograph was just the beginning of a series of historical work about the Jewish past in Łódź that was, I quote, not a very distant past, but nevertheless rich and interesting. Instead of big celebration, Mintzberg says, this commemoration of the past stemmed from the conviction, longer quote, our modest contribution to the history of Jewish culture in modern, not modest, our modern contribution to the history of Jewish culture in Poland won't be without influence on a future researcher of the history of Polish Jewry. In our study, we want to eternalize the first stage of development from the simple Hevra Kadisha of the past to the modern form of Jewish self-government. So again, this perspective on how Jewish institutions are changing. The Old Jewish Cemetery, through it, has a value of its own as a monument and a museum, which I find fascinating that Agudat Israel activist is saying it, in this case, served as a pretext for archival and documenting effort pertaining to Kahal relations. And this book comes out in 1938, like many other initiatives of writing Polish Jewish history. Clearly, there was a plan to do a lot more and a lot more done in Łódź for Łódź. Mintzberg praised the scholars for including biographies of many citizens. Among them, not few are deserving on a field of social and economic activities, pioneers of commerce and industry. And then he makes a reference to contemporary situation, how much these are now important for Polish Jews. Now, Friedman survived the Holocaust in Lwów, today Lviv, in the ghetto, in Janowska camp, and in hiding. After the war, he returned to Łódź via Lublin as the director of the Central Jewish Historical Commission, about which we'll hear, I believe, on the last day of the conference. He has not returned to writing the history of Jews in Łódź, although he wrote about Rumkowski in his study of Judenräte leaders, and he likely oversaw early stages of research on Litzmannstadt Ghetto as the head of the commission. The field of urban East European Jewish history, and in particular scholarly interest in casting scholarly gaze on Jewish metropolitan center has changed dramatically. For the most part, in Eastern Europe, it is no longer written with a Jewish audience, local Jewish audience in mind, guiding it and providing historical framework. This is done nowadays more by studies such as Jews of Greater Miami, Jewish Miami Beach, Jewish Chicago, and so on and so forth, endless studies that have very positive reviews on Amazon. I'm just jealous. The urge to defend Jewish economic patterns does not have, it seems to me, I mean, you can argue, I would love to hear, doesn't have immediate political relevance of urban studies. I mean, it does in the context of the Holocaust, but not pre-war, not so much, to include questions and approaches. And contemporary urban Jewish studies have grown to include questions and approaches that were largely missing from pioneering works by Friedman. For once, while interested in showing a diverse Jewish community, he paid attention to industrialists and workers, most of them men, and again, women appear, but really as a afterthought and a margin. Likewise, the picture that emerges from those earlier studies divided protagonists into clear, clean national religious categories: Jews, Poles, Germans, Jews, Christians. There was nothing in between, no intersectionality as such, even though he notes processes of Polonization among Łódź Jews. Friedman was not paying close attention to material culture and variety of urban Jewish cultures. He was not a historian of culture. Last but not least, writing his research on Łódź before the Holocaust, he described a relatively stable community. And his was not really part of diaspora studies that is now so thriving, just to mention important work of Rebecca Coburn on Białystok, where Białystok becomes just the beginning of the story. But I think that just looking at his writing and what is going on today, which some of it we already started seeing in a first panel, we can see how much this legacy is a way in which we can engage with contemporary research and think of more. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this very rich survey of historiography on Łódź, and with focus on Filip Friedman, on whose shoulders probably everyone stands who engages with the history of Jewish Łódź. I think he had to stop in 1863 because archival material was not available. That was only repatriated after the mid-30s or so. So that's also one of the reasons why the late 19th century is a bit in the background in his works. I think one remark by Małgosia from the first panel resonates with your reflection on what is a metropolis, which is not a metropolis like Paris, London, obviously, but it is certainly a place which is set in the middle of a network of textile production and also migration, origin, and going back and forth, and is a very unusual type of a metropolis because it doesn't become a pulsating center. In comparison, for example, in contradistinction from Warsaw, and what I found interesting is that why we focus on the easy bits very easily and with pleasure, Poznański, Silberstein, the famous Prusak, these famous names. What I found in the sources, and that's something. I mean, I'd be happy to hear more, to be corrected on that. What we have in Łódź is a different type of Jewish civil society, and that's something which is not sufficiently understood and not sufficiently explored, and that has to do with the really disrupted history of this place, of the massive impact of economic crisis, of mass misery, pauperization, rejuvenation, initiative by hundreds and thousands of people to survive, but also of something like a middle class, which is more, which has more impact than in other places. So there is less weight of the traditional communal elite, which is bearing down on other communities like Kraków or Lublin or whatever. So there is a different dynamic which I don't think we have sufficiently understood, and the role of Łódź sitting in a network of places, Pabianice and Zgierz and these many other Brzeziny. Nobody speaks about Brzezina, although it was crucial for the textile industry in Łódź.
He does, though.
Yes, well, standing on his shoulders. So yeah, thank you. I think there's so much to develop, and it's I really look forward to the conversation.
I wanted to thank you so much, Francois. So I wanted to say apropos, Małgosia, your comments in the previous panel, because as I was rereading Friedman for this talk, I was struck that he makes extensive comments about the influence of the Civil War in the States, about constantly compares the situation to the situation in England, living conditions, economic production models. So he's writing local history with a very global eye. in a way that, again, it's almost 100 years, right? His research, it's still extremely fresh.
Yeah, thank you very much for this fascinating keynote. Your topic is so far away from what I'm doing, so I do hope that my question is not too naive. You talked about the Jewish entrepreneurs and non-Jewish workers. Is that a topic that has never ever been researched? So I'm a bit surprised about it, and I always thought in my naive understanding that capitalists do not bother about the faith of the workforce.
Well, so I think that there are two things. I think that Friedman is very consciously writing in the context of the discourse about economic negative influence of Jews on the economy of Poland, superfluous people that should be shipped off somewhere. And so I spent almost a decade with Friedman. I feel I went through his 60 boxes of papers at EVA. Sadly, close to nothing personal. This was a man who wrote about other people's lives, not so eagerly about his personal views. But I think that in a way he writes, every time he breaks from 1823 to comment on the Second Polish Republic, this is where the weight of contemporary discussion sort of reveals itself for someone who I think at heart would love to just give us tables and numbers for pages and pages. So I think he's writing in this conversation more than in others, but he engages with a rich literature on the English, on industrialization and textile stuff.
There was a very dramatic turn in Filip Friedman's career. His emigration to the States. He left archives, which he knew so well. He decided to start a new chapter of his life. Have you got any information what exactly pushed him to that decision? Are there any letters or
that question?
Documents?
Yeah, that question I actually can answer. Not what, but who pushed him. Salo Baron, who was his mentor in Vienna, who was critical in having his doctoral dissertation on the struggle for rights in Galicia published, and who brought him to New York. He offered him a position, a somewhat problematic position. It was sort of not, I didn't quite understand what status he had. It seems to me that he was teaching at Columbia, but he didn't, he was teaching at Columbia. I saw his syllabi, but he didn't have a sort of a stable permanent position, but he was kept by Salo Baron, and that funded his life there. And in the letters, there were at some point he's beginning to learn English, still in Europe, and in the exchanges, it seems to me that he's hesitating between Israel and New York, but then he's offered this professional opportunity with someone that was very important for his academic life for 2 decades. there is also a question of family. I'm very interested in family networks, and those boxes in Evo include a lot of letters from cousins, not very close immediate family. In fact, the one surviving sibling, his sister, Guta, remained in Warsaw and continued corresponding with Friedman in New York. So he was getting updates from Warsaw, and he was getting updates on a situation at the Jewish Historical Institute from his friend from the pre-war years, from Artur Eisenbach. So he's very much plugged into Polish-Jewish history writing after the war as well. He deserves a big biography, if you didn't get my inclination.
I have one question, Natalia, that may be a little bit, off topic, but I will still try. Did Friedman write something about, or did he try to describe the position, situate Łódź in a broader web of, relationship, like center periphery or marginal
very
central?
much so.
And because I think today, Eastern Europe is this proverbial periphery. Or semi-periphery in the best case scenario, and I do my own research showed that Łódź was really a beating heart of Eastern European capitalism, one of several places where as chaotic as it was, that it was a beating heart of a certain type of economy that was expanding and booming in the 19th and early 20th century. So. I'm really curious about how Friedman understood, placed Łódź on the map.
So this is, it's fascinating. It's something that I had in my notes and I ended up not reading out to you. But he oscillates from this imperial gaze on Łódź metropolis into nation state. Although again, he doesn't write a monograph on the 20th century, right? And even when he is corresponding, and I believe this is in a letter to Eisenbach, where he basically says, I'm engaging in Holocaust right now, but I really would love to go back to my previous historical profession, but he doesn't say and write about Łódź. He says write about emancipation, which I think is interesting. But he's very much writing about Łódź as an important place, and tied, as I said earlier, tied with England, tied with the United States, tied with economic ups and downs on a global scale. So this is not, somewhere in the middle of nowhere on the margins of the big world. I'm happy to send you the quotes if this is useful.
Yeah, thanks, Natalia, for this wonderful talk. I guess I'm interested in what you described about Filip Friedman's work, that you said he described the Łódź Jewish community as very stable. And so what I wanted to know then is how do you think what he thought what Jewishness meant for a community or in Łódź? And especially since you also said that in his works, he described the conflict within the Jewish community. So can you explain how it's both stable and...
Stable as in people not leaving. I mean, he's not really writing about immigration of Lodzer Jews. He's writing about people coming in. That's what he's interested in. And this is what I reread Rebecca Coburn's book on Białystok, and it was remarkable how much he's not following forget after the Holocaust, that's a whole different ballgame, but he's not really writing about that Landsmannschaft diaspora before the war. That's sort of beyond his periphery, but which had a economic implications for Jews in Łódź as well. But again, then his published work is primarily the first half of 19th century, which is why it might not have become his question.